And it doesn't even include the influence over natural resources of First Nations, really. I was also a keynote speaker at the Northern Land Claimants Conference last May. There was 22 now, I think, of them. And it was an interesting conference because, first of all, I didn't realize the impact of their treaties on so much of the Canadian landmass. But it was also interesting for me because a lot of the leaders still have an old mindset. And throughout most of our lives, because of the situation we've inherited, we've been conditioned to continually try to define ourselves by the federal government. And so at that conference, some of the leaders were complaining that the Minister of Indian Affairs didn't show up to speak, and that the ministry didn't give them about $1 million. And part of my presentation, what I did was I made a presentation on what value of resources that they control, and compared it to the largest mining company in the world, which at that time was BHP. Had a market cap of about $143 billion. If those tribes with those treaties pooled their natural resources, the value of those resources, if they dealt with them in a sensible market way, they could get multiples of value from them, probably would exceed $150 trillion. And it's just looking at things a little bit differently, with a little bit more maybe education, but knowledge of what's going on in the world. Here, on the one hand, if we work together and we do things a little bit differently with a different mindset, we're holding all the cards, but in that old mindset, the federal government's still holding all the cards. It's a funny thing, but it's changing because we're getting a lot more young educated people. In spite of the system, the Indian Act system, there's a lot of young, good leaders being elected. And what this should lead to is more revenue from resources in a way that makes sense to Aboriginal people. I don't know if you're aware of it, but in BC, the provincial government proposed a new act to share resources with all the First Nations in BC called the Reconciliation Act. And I thought it was incredible. Every resource in the province would be shared, and there would be shared decision making, a lot of those resources, with First Nations. But both the provincial government and the Aboriginal leaders who negotiated the agreement hadn't consulted their own constituencies. So Aboriginal people shot down the agreement, which really surprised me because it was very beneficial to them, but they hadn't been consulted. And the province hadn't consulted its constituents either. So that fell by the wayside. And the reason this kind of agreement is important to the provinces who largely own the resources can be seen, for example, in Alberta, where in Alberta, if the tribes stopped the development of a 100,000 barrel per day oil sands plant and they blocked it for a year, that would cost the province between $200 to $300 million. If they stopped the project, that would represent about a $4 billion loss to the Treasury of Alberta. So when you start thinking about the numbers, I think good sense starts to prevail on the side of some of the federal government. So that kind of thing is, I think, developing, that kind of thinking is developing more in Canada. I think Alberta is talking about sharing the wealth from the resources with the tribes. I understood there was some amendments planned for the Mining Act in Ontario, though I haven't tracked those. And as part of what I've been doing is I've been involved with a group from Vancouver called the RCI Capital Group. RCI Capital Group is a group that has a lot of connections with various Asian countries, and we've set up two $1 billion funds for financing Aboriginal resource projects, whether whether you own the resources outright. If you own the resources outright, it's a very simple equation. We can come in with the resources to help you develop them, and probably with a joint venture partner directly, or where the resources are held in a lease by a public company or whoever owns them, we can finance the First Nation and assist the First Nation in getting equity and possibly board representation in the companies in the territory where they're doing the business. So there's different kinds of thinking emerging about how these changes can be made, and these can lead to this kind of opportunity where Aboriginal people are being consulted and have ownership of various kinds of resources. I don't know if you're familiar with the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline. Mackenzie Valley Pipeline is possibly going to be going ahead, and I bet you it's going to be a $30 billion pipeline by the time it's built. And as part of getting approvals for that project, the Aboriginal population owns 33% of the pipeline, and I think they may end up in a situation where they own 50% of it. There's a little tribe from Alaska that just approached me recently. The tribe is called the Chugach tribe. Back in 1969, when the oil companies wanted to start exploiting the oil resources in Alaska, they had to settle treaties up there because there weren't any treaties. And so treaties were settled through the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And because the Chugach tribe had no experience in business, they almost lost all of their assets. And they went through a period where they had to figure out how to do business by getting into partnerships and so on. So the three communities in the Chugach tribe, which represent about 1,800 people, went from losing almost everything to being in a situation right now where they have about $1 billion a year in revenue and about 8,000 employees, and they don't own any casinos. So, and they're in some very sophisticated businesses. So they approached me because they're interested. Alaska is going to build a pipeline as well to try and get the gas from Alaska into the continental U.S., and they have to come through Canada. And they're interested in looking at possibly building the pipeline with First Nations in Canada. So these kinds of opportunities are emerging. There's more recognition of our role.